Hello, everybody. A couple of days ago, we did a show on something called Manhood, the coming revival of democracy, with a Danish writer, Morten Høj Jensen, who was writing about the great German novelist Thomas Mann. He's an expert on him. And he described all Mann's work. It was actually a conversation about Mann's defense of democracy in America in the late 1930s. But he described all of Mann's books, or his novels in particular, as confessionals, that they're hard to summarize because they reflect Mann himself. But when it comes to Mann confessionals, nothing much compares with something I read last month in the New York Times: How I Learned That the Problem in My Marriage Was Me, by my guest today, Daniel Oppenheimer. It's a highly confessional, long essay, and Daniel is joining us from his home in Austin, Texas. Daniel, is this the first time you've been compared to Thomas Mann?
Yeah, but hopefully not the last, Andrew.
Yeah, well, you deserve it. In terms of this confessional, I have to admit, I read it and I actually listened to it online as well on the New York Times podcast. And I was struck, shall we say, by the fact that you actually wrote it and acknowledged all the problems and challenges and perhaps solutions in your marriage. Did you have any qualms about it? Did you talk to your wife, Jess, about it before you actually wrote this thing?
Yeah, any qualms is an understatement. Massive amounts of qualms. Yeah, I talked to Jess, my wife, about it, not just before I wrote it, but while I was writing it. And I would say I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that there was a fair amount of negotiation going on during the process on all ends, on the ends in terms of the New York Times Magazine editors wanting certain things from me, and then talking to Jess about what I would and wouldn't reveal about our marriage, about myself, about her. And then other figures in the picture, I guess, are my parents, who I wasn't in conversation with. I wasn't kind of giving them the option of vetoing anything, but I was sort of in my mind thinking about how much I wanted to give in the article about them and about my childhood. I don't think you can talk about how screwed up you are as much as I do in that article without at a minimum there being some implication that some of that screwed upness came from my childhood. And so there's that just at a baseline. And then also, if I want to say explicitly about what kind of context I grew up in and how that led to the complicated adult figure that I am. So yeah, there were a lot of qualms, a lot of negotiations, and then just trying to sort of deal with all of that and be a decent person at the same time that I wanted to be a good writer and be true to the subject and have a kind of authentic voice. So yeah, it was complicated. In that sense, it was by far the most complicated thing that I've ever written, because I don't usually write confessional stuff.
Yeah, and your parents, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but my interpretation is that your parents didn't come out of this particularly well. How do they feel about the article? I mean, I assume they're both still alive.
My parents are both still alive. They were a little bit upset with me. I mean, I don't think that I make them look terrible. They were
You don't make them look particularly great parents.
I would say that I'm trying to. That's interesting. They felt that way. They felt, I think, that I was a little bit unfair to them, or that one of the difficult things, and I'm not sure that I solved this entirely, was I didn't want to go into immense detail about my childhood because I didn't want to throw them under the bus. But I think that also left things vague that may have implied in certain ways that it was worse than it was. I mean, they were not physically abusive. They were not neglectful. They were very loving. They were also kind of dysfunctional in their own ways and kind of bearing their own load of trauma. So there was a lot of complexity and a certain amount of emotional dysfunction in our home. But I think to an extent that's probably, I mean, I don't know how you gauge something like this. Maybe they were like median parents, slightly above average parents. I don't know. We're also screwed up. I mean, you don't have to consent to that characterization of us, but the human species is just sort of, I think, at a baseline, pretty screwed up and dysfunctional. So I don't think they were worse than average in that sense, but worse than average isn't always so great.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree, but what do I know? So how I learned that the problem in my marriage was me is very explicit about the problems Daniel, that you had with your marriage. Not everyone will have read this piece. It's certainly worth reading. I would encourage everyone who's interested in confessionals and marriages of one kind or another to read it. But tell our listeners and viewers and our listeners about your marriage. What was the problem, or what is the problem with it?
Yeah, let me see if I can answer that efficiently. I would say so. So Jess and I have been married about 18 years now. We've been together for 20, and it's always been a roller coaster. It's always been periods of real connection and intimacy, alternating with periods of disconnection and anger and frustration and resentment. It's always been up and down, almost from the beginning. Um, and I think I'm trying to think of how to characterize that. So fights can get pretty nasty. We can sort of be cold to each other for these days. It's not weeks or months, but I would say early in our marriage, it could occasionally be for those that kind of lengths of time. Now it's more hours or days sometimes when things are bad. I can get very angry. I'm very reactive. So if I feel like I'm being disrespected or not being treated thoughtfully or spoken to kindly, I can snap, I can scream, I can withdraw and get very cold and contemptuous. And on her side, she has her own mechanisms for dealing with distress and feeling rejected by me or abandoned by me. I'd say they're more of the variety of like, withdrawing affection, not so much yelling or being aggressive, but kind of withdrawing affection and being cold and kind of retreating behind or sort of behind walls. And then criticism, but sort of indirect criticism, complaints, um, maybe some what I would characterize as controlling behavior, things like that. We're just kind of have long been in and out of those dynamics. We kind of push each other's buttons, and things have gotten slowly better over time. I think if you compared a snapshot of 18 years ago to now, it would look pretty dramatically different. But the article was about, I mean, some of it was about the past, but a lot of it was about how we still struggle with these things. I still struggle with flying off the handle if I feel like, she's not being nice to me or she's saying
Yeah,
something
and,
that feels
and
critical.
with all credit, I mean, you're amazingly honest about your own poor behavior. You write about I think it's your 48th birthday party put on by friends and family, and you stormed out because you felt slightly insecure or ignored. So you don't hold back on this, Daniel.
Yeah. Yeah, I talked about that. I think I talked about an incident where we were just over at some friends
Yeah.
for
I
dinner, and
told my wife about that one, actually. So next time that happens with me, I say, well, Daniel did it. Why can't I?
and Jazz said something that I perceived as critical, and maybe was a little bit. I mean, a little bit. Not
About being on social media, right?
spending my time right. I was talking about some exchange I'd had on Substack on back and forth with somebody, and she was frustrated. I think she may differ, but she was frustrated because she had been putting in a lot of time on the domestic front because I'd had a big project at work, and so it kind of revealed a little bit that all the time I was spending at work wasn't all exclusively devoted to doing the work. I was also kind of messing around on uh, on social media. And so she made a kind of snide comment about, "Oh, good that you have so much time to be, playing around on social media." And can I swear on this
Of
podcast, Dan?
course.
Oh yeah. And
You're encouraged.
I just said, "Fuck you," basically, just like I'm not sure if they use the words in the article. But yeah, I just said "fuck you," and not in like a super loud way, but it was. Then the story of my 48th birthday, it was not actually even something that she did that set me off. It was something that one of my kids did, was just being bratty in a total normal way. And she and I had been at each other in the days leading up to that. And it all got, and I just kind of snapped and just stood up abruptly and just walked out and kind of sulked outside for like 15 minutes in front of our friends. And it was very embarrassing to her. And it just, that kind of thing. I still can do sometimes. Not, I mean, less than I did, but too often, I think.
Yeah, I haven't been nervous about having people on my show, but I have to admit, I'm waiting for you to snap, Daniel.
I thought you were gonna go in a different direction, which was whether I was gonna push you about your own behavior in your relationships. But no, I'm not gonna swing.
Yeah, well, you're more than welcome to do that. It was interesting in the piece that you think of your marriage, you sort of externalize it or mediate it. You imagine it in terms of, at its best, maybe a Jude Apatow comedy at its worst, maybe, or in a middle way, you're like Woody Allen's Annie Hall. Do you think this way of sort of mediating or using media to think of ourselves, is that one of the challenges of modern marriage or even modern existence, is that we have so many references, so many people and images to emulate, and we can never live up to it? It's the FOMO problem, the Instagram problem.
I mean, I would say yes. I mean, 100%. I think that we're haunted by the sort of cultural representations of marriage. I mean, there's no total escape from that probably in any culture. In a sense, there's some production of like a narrative of what marriage should be, but we have this sort of hyper saturated cultural representations of marriage. And it's complicated, right? I mean, one way to characterize it is just the romantic comedy that the ideal relationship is just, not only are the people best friends and they're funny and silly together, but they have hot sex, and but then they also, if they have kids, they have deep, deep connections to their kids, and they also have interesting careers, and they have it all. And that is in fact a representation of it. And there's probably a version of it you could characterize on Instagram or social media or something like that, where it's more pictures and little snippets and things like that. It's not that there aren't other more complicated representations of it, although I sometimes think that the dominant ones are either that idealized version of it, or it's kind of inverse, which is train wrecks of relationships. Maybe what you'd see on whether it's a reality show that's just a total disastrous dysfunction, or these ones like Real Housewives or something like that, where they're kind of ostensibly sort of happy, but the people are so shallow that part of the experience of watching it is feeling superior to them. So it feels like there's either, the dominant ones are either these representation of the train wrecks, and that was kind of the indie film, kind of cold and distant, where when you see fights, when you see people being awful to each other, what that's indicative of is that you have a terrible marriage. Or on the other hand, you have the romantic comedy version of it, where maybe there's fights or something like that, but they're sort of cute and charming, or they're just sort of a preface to, heightening the suspense towards the ultimate resolution into, total marital bliss or something like that. I don't think there's a lot in the middle that we have reference to, or if there is, it's not the kind of dominant narrative of what relationships are, what romance is.
I mean, this is the next thing. We'll come to this on therapy. Well, and it's the story of how you went to a therapist called Terry Real, who's a real name.
Mm-hmm.
We'll come to him in a second. But one of the things that occurred to me when I was reading this is why you were so. You've obviously been to many therapists in the past, and it was something that concerned you and presumably Jess. But why you stayed together? There's obviously your 3 kids, but people get divorced, and usually doesn't kill kids. I've been divorced. Why the desperation to keep the marriage together? If that's a fair way of putting it.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a desperation to keep the marriage together. Let me see. It's funny. Somebody, Jess has had a number of people ask her that.
And she's, to add to the irony or the complexity of all this, she herself is a therapist, isn't she?
Yeah. She's not only she's a therapist who specializes in couples therapy, and an exceptionally good one. So let me answer that in a few different ways. Somebody asked Jess that after this article came out, and not in a spirit of judgment, but just curiosity, I think, where you're coming from. And one thing Jess said, and this is the kind of best possible version of or the most, positive light one could shed on a relationship, which is Jess said, if I got divorced and I was out on the apps and I met Dan, somehow it wasn't him, but it was him. So he had all of the qualities that he has, all the positive qualities he had, but there was none of the baggage. There was none of, the complexity of it. And I just met this guy and what he was like out in the world. I would think to myself, I've hit the lottery, I've won the lottery. Like, he's exactly what I want. He's smart in the ways I want. He's, he has a sense of humor like I want. He's attractive. I think we've always felt that way about each other. We've always felt, attraction to each other, physical attraction, social attraction, psychological attraction. We're really interested in the same things. We laugh a lot together. We have a lot of interests in common. Um, I think we're both, but I mean, I don't wanna, so that's the most positive version, and we have issues, we have deep issues, but I think we've always long believed that those issues were as much what we brought to the relationship as what we encountered in each other, so there wasn't, I think, what is often the illusion, which is that if you get out of the relationship you're in, you can just meet the right person, and then all of those issues, or most of them, will waft away. I'm not sure that's never the case. Well, I don't think it's ever that easy. I'm not saying it's never the case that you're with the wrong person, but I think we felt like there was a pretty good chance that if we split with each other and got into another thing, we would recapitulate a lot of the same dynamics. I mean, I also, like, divorce is not the end of the world, but I don't think it's great for kids. Like, so that's important. If we didn't have kids, or if the kids were out of the house, is it possible that we would have divorced by now? Yeah, it's possible. I mean, that was a thing that was holding us together, not just trying to protect the kids, but also liking the family we had, and enjoying our lives as a family. And then all of the other, I mean, and this is a more, this isn't quite as positive an answer to that question, but I'm sure if you've been divorced, I'm sure divorce sucks. I mean, it's a shit show, even in the best case scenario, and it creates, financial stresses and stresses on the kids, and all of the grieving of the marriage and the family you had. So we've been pretty committed to seeing if we can make the marriage work. And again, we've had a lot of strengths at the same time that we've had a lot of problems. And I don't think we've ever been that close to divorce, though I know both of us have had moments when we've thought to ourselves it'd be easier. But there's a big difference between having those moments and having those thoughts and actually taking action to initiate a divorce. And I won't speak for her. I've never been that close to thinking that was the best option.
Having a wife who was a therapist, a counselor of couples, did that compound the problems, or has it compounded the problems of your marriage, or is that one way that you think helped keep the marriage together? I mean, we're going to come to your star therapist in a second, but was that a help or a hindrance generally?
I think it was an enormous help. I mean, and not that it was never the case when I got frustrated, where I felt like, oh, she's subjecting me to some analysis. She just read some book or did some training where they characterize people in this way, and now I'm kind of under the microscope and she's diagnosing me. Not that that never happened. It did happen, but by and large, I mean, I think it's been an enormous help. We're both really complicated people. We're both really analytical and also judgmental people. So I was doing that to her, and in my way, as she was doing it to me. But I think the biggest thing has just been, I mean, she has a joke. I forget whether I wrote so many versions of this article. I forget whether it made it into the article or not. But she has a thing that if she and I get in a fight, it's guaranteed. If we get in a big fight, it's guaranteed the next day she'll go into her office, and at least one of the couples she'll see will have had basically the same fight. And usually, just because of the dynamics of that therapy session, she'll have to be especially empathetic to the person who is kind of on my side of the fight. Um, so, and it's a lot of, it creates a lot of humility and introspection. I just think she has worked harder on herself and been more likely to take responsibility for her role in these dynamics, because she sees it, and because her job is to help other people kind of work through. We all kind of fall into mostly just the same relatively small number of patterns, and I think she just is, that's just shoved in her face over and over and over again. And I think over 18, well, she hasn't been a therapist all 18 years, but over the past 10 or 15 years, it's just made her a better person, forced her to work harder on the relationship, and also just bring some of those things to me, not in a sort of accusatory spirit, but just bring some of those ideas and frameworks to me that have helped me be more introspective and work on myself. So it's just been a help. I don't know if that would be true for everybody who's married to a therapist. I was just talking to a friend who's talking about his divorce from his wife, who's a therapist of many years. It's not like it's a guarantee of perfect harmony, but I think it's been a help for us.
You were introduced to me by a mutual friend, Bill Derasewicz. He was on your podcast. He's been on mine several times. He wrote a book called Excellent Sheep, and we recently had a conversation about the challenges of young men in America. in the introduction to this, I talked about manhood with two N's, of course, Thomas Mann. But the essay itself and the way you represented yourself, Daniel, there was a lot of manness in it,
Yeah.
with one N, not two. Is it in some ways? I mean, obviously, you can't universalize what you went through or your own experience or your own nature. But is this in a part a book about men struggling to reinvent themselves in the early 21st century?
Yeah. No, I mean, no doubt. I mean, I was thinking about that a lot, and there was a lot of stuff that I wrote about that that didn't make it into the article, and people I interviewed. I don't know if you know this guy Richard Reeves. I think the name of his
Yeah,
book is.
Richard's an old friend,
Oh,
and
okay.
he's been on the show a couple of times. And actually, we share the same book agent, so I've heard I heard about that the of Boys and Men story for years before it came out. And I don't know if he told you this story, but one of the astonishing things is the book is a huge bestseller, and now, of course, he's become almost a household name. But that book got turned down by every major
Oh, I
publishing
didn't
house.
know that. Is that right?
And the only people who were willing to publish it were Brookings, and he worked for them. So it was a favor to him, because people are so, or perhaps were, maybe he's beginning to make this more mainstream, but popularize the issues that he writes about.
Yeah. So I mean, so you know better than me. I mean, yes,
Well, equally, I don't know about better.
I understand. I buy. I think it's a really good book. I pretty much buy almost everything he says. I think men are absolutely struggling to figure out how to be in, you know, this new, whatever you want to call it, post-feminist, feminist world, a world in which, by and large, on most metrics, women seem to be outperforming men, and the roles have shifted pretty dramatically. And we've ended up in a situation, I think, particularly in relationships, where a lot of men feel just inadequate. Like, what is our role, like, in these modern kind of, most of us, I think even most conservatives, I would say, share a vision of marriage that's much more sort of, I don't know what the word would be, equalitarian, than the sort of, even as people kind of fantasize about going back to the 1950s. I don't think most people in America who are in relationships that are subscribing to an ideal where the man is kind of, has this sort of dominant role. So on the one hand, we have this kind of equitable marriage paradigm, but it's calling for sort of a performance from both people that women just seem better equipped in a lot of ways to do. I mean, it calls for a lot of emotional work and work of kind of managing the household that, for sort of complex combination of reasons, women just often seem better at. And then you put on top of that there's a lot of relationships where women are earning more money, and women often seem less attracted, and that can be a deterrent to being attracted to potential partners if they make less money than they do. So there's all of these, and I just don't think men, by and large, have figured out how to be in this space. And I'd put myself in that category.
Yeah, and
And I
that came out probably in that perhaps overreaction, Daniel, to your wife's joke about social media, feeling that you weren't doing as much work as you should be, that you were wasting your time on the internet.
That's right. I very easily feel criticized. You're not carrying your weight. She does feel like a lot of the times I'm not carrying my weight, kind of in terms of managing the details of the household. And I think one of the interesting things is, yeah. So I'm trying to like, one of the interesting things is actually, if I could just do some of the emotional stuff better, I think she could actually bear the ways in which, I'm a little bit absent-minded or ADHD or something. I'm not always so great about details. If I could do a lot of the emotional work better in ways that I would really like to, I think that would take a lot of the weight off of the other stuff. But I mean, it's just, I don't know I don't know if you have any wisdom. I didn't, it's funny. I asked Richard about it. I mean, I think he has a lot of good policy ideas, particularly with dealing with boys.
Well,
Uh,
he has three boys of his own, which he seems to have learned quite a lot from.
but I don't think he has any, would claim to have any great insight into how to deal with these issues around adult romantic relationships and the sort of dysfunctional dynamics that emerge. And a lot of men, and I'm not sure if he'd buy this diagnosis, but a lot of men who seem to get to adulthood with a relatively kind of immature emotional life.
Yeah. I would
And
certainly include myself in that one.
I don't know what the answer is. It just seems like it doesn't seem like one of the things I was trying to get to in the article. I'm not sure I totally got to it, but I think one of the things I was thinking about a lot is I don't think if you think about it politically that either side has quite the right answer. I think the conservative notion is something like go back to the 1950s, just reinstitute a kind of retrograde idea of masculinity, of sort of masculine dominance, maybe masculine stoicism or something like that. And I think often the left wing version of it is a kind of, I hate to use this term, like a kind of, it's not a feminized man. I mean, it is a kind of feminized man, but really what it is it's actually a strong woman and a relatively passive, deferential man, which I think is no kind of answer either.
Yeah, and speaking of the politics, you wrote an interesting book a few years ago, Exit Right, the people who left the left and reshaped the American century. You include, you got 6 examples, including Christopher Hitchens. I talked about Christopher Hitchens on the Thomas Mann thing. And also David Horowitz. I think he's the father of Ben Horowitz, who you've also written about, the Silicon Valley billionaire.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a political dimension to this? You were on you were talking with Bill about the rise of the not left. They're not the right, but we don't know what the not left is. What's the politics of all this in terms of the conventional right-left distinction and those, shall we say, traditional men, the Christopher Hitchens, the Ronald Reagans, the David Horowitzes, who kind of are pioneers in a weird way of our new world?
Whew, I don't know. I'd be interested to see what you have to say about this. I mean, I find myself stuck in the middle, which is that I don't think either side. I mean, like I don't know how to look at it and say it's not political. I mean, I think there were a lot of people who've talked about both of Trump's elections in the idea, in the context of gender roles and a reaction against, maybe what people experience or a lot of men experience, particularly young men experience as a kind of stigmatization from the left of masculinity, of male heterosexuality, and Trump obviously representing this kind of atavistic retrograde version of kind of male dominance or something like this. So I don't know how you don't think of it politically. I don't think I was listening to a interview with Ezra Klein was interviewing David Shore, and they were talking about just some of the election results and how huge gender divide there is amongst young people in particular, amongst young men and young women, with young men trending much more to the right than actually older men, which is interesting and maybe a little bit surprising. But I'd have to think a lot of that sort of politically, that political tendency is a reaction against what is perceived of as a kind of, whether it's stigmatizing men or straight men from the left, or just somehow there being no space. I don't know if it's stigmatizing or there just being no positive narrative of masculinity on the left, and being drawn more towards these figures like Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan, or at the most grotesque end, Andrew Tate or something like that. So I think it's deeply political. I don't know how to characterize what my position is. I find myself in the middle, which is I totally buy a
You're
lot of.
but you're like in the middle here. You're roadkill in Texas, aren't you, Daniel? I mean, especially since you're in Texas. Your own governor made that famous comment about if you're in the middle, you're roadkill. So
yeah, I mean, maybe I'm roadkill in Texas.
who was the governor? Who made that? It was a woman.
Oh, I don't know. If it was a woman, it must have been Ann Richards.
Yeah, it was Ann Richards.
I don't know the line, but like, yeah. I mean, but am I roadkill in like California too, or Cambridge, Massachusetts? I don't know. I mean,
you'll come to Berkeley. You'll feel very much at home in Berkeley, I think.
Well, but will I feel at home in my critique of what I think has been left-wing errors on gender and masculinity?
You might, and actually coming to this in all seriousness, in your conversation with Bill. And I'm not sure if it was you or he who says this, it comes to this: the left has made itself the enemy of the life force, of vitality, of eros. There's not a lot of sex in your book, but clearly you have a decent sex life with your wife, otherwise you wouldn't be still together. And that was probably one of the deals. But is this what's going on? Is that men have had, if you like, the life force taken out of them, which explains the popularity and attraction of Peterson or Rogan or even criminals like Tate?
I think we have a lot of issues around how I ended up thinking about it while I was working on the article, and this actually came out of some really good conversations with Terry Real, which with the therapist who we went to see, which is it's about power. I mean, life force is another word, but it's about power, which is I think and this is probably true of women too, but it's probably more true of men, which is power is attractive and power is desirable. I think we've stigmatized power on the left in ways that have done us no favors in all sorts of ways. Have done us no favors because we haven't thought about how to responsibly exercise power in a political space, but also just interpersonally and romantically. I don't care if you're gay, straight, trans, cis, you know, anything, people are attracted to power, and I think they should be. I mean, should is the wrong word. I think it's just like it's visceral, it's probably biological. And so if as men we want other people to be attracted to us, and again, this is whether it's men we want attracted to us or non-binary people or women, but in this context we're primarily talking about women. If we want women to be attracted to us, I think it's a good idea to think about being somebody who's comfortable exercising power. But the distinction that Terry draws, and I think this is a really profound one, is power over versus power with. And and I think what Terry would say, and I agree with him,
And this
is
is Terry Real, your high-end
our high end. Yeah,
your
really.
high-end therapist who the only reason you were able to work with him is that the deal was you couldn't afford him. What is he, 30 grand a shot? More probably, but his deal with you is he could use the videos of you and Jess with his trainees.
Yeah. Terry's very high. Yeah. I mean, he's a really incredibly compelling. I was glad that I was able to kind of be a little bit of a fanboy towards him in the article, which is not always something that's easy to do in these kind of mainstream journalistic contexts. He's a really sort of profound guy. And does a lot of work, actually. I mean, he is very expensive if you just wanna kinda see him one-on-one as a private
I
client.
mean, Bruce Springsteen, you said, went to him.
Yeah, he does more work. He actually does more work than most of these big time therapists do, I think, trying to kinda get the word out, whether it's doing the kind of thing he did with us or doing trainings of other people or doing free webinars. But Terry is a very powerful masculine figure, and if you just meet him, if you
Right,
viscerally
and you
interact with
definitely
him,
get that across in the
like,
piece. It's
there is nothing passive, about Terry. He is also a very emotionally articulate, open, vulnerable person, and I think that's what he's modeling, not just for men, but for women too. But he is not against power. He is for power, but it's power that you're exercising in collaboration with your partner or with whomever, honestly. And I think that's the very narrow path, or it feels narrow, that I think, you know, personally, but politically, we have to find a way to walk. Like, passive men are not attractive. I think they're not gonna feel good about themselves. I think they're not gonna succeed politically, they're not gonna succeed romantically, and they're mostly, if they're passive in a sort of relational, in sort of relating to other people, often what that means is they're also suppressing, uh they're creating a lot of underground resentment and hostility, because I don't think as human beings we generally want to be and experience ourselves as happy and content and fulfilled when we're passive. So that is the thing that I think, particularly all these critiques coming from the left, which I think are very important in all sorts of ways, but they have left a lot of men uncertain and embarrassed about exerting power and being forceful
yeah, and
figures
that's
in
the
the world.
Reeves point. But I don't know if you've have, have have you read the new book by Mark Dunkelman, Why Nothing Works?
No, I think I heard him interviewed on a podcast.
And
I haven't read the book.
it's another one of the you talked about Ezra Klein's new book. It's very similar to that. And his argument from a progressive point of view is there's two kinds of American progressivism, the Hamiltonian and the Jeffersonian kind. And it's the Hamiltonian kind which has always been successful. That was the New Deal. That was the Great Society. The Jeffersonian side has always been very ambiguous about power, always very suspicious of power. And he sees that as the crisis. And I think the more you talk, and I've thought about this in some detail myself, the problem, as you say, is our relationship with power. As you say, passive men are not attractive. Terry Real, who could have been, I mean, the more I read about him, he could have been invented by Martin Amis. He could have walked out of a Martin Amis novel. He is, and I have to say this, he is real.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
he's
he
not
is.
passive. He says what he thinks. He's not shy. So this is a broad political issue, isn't it? And Terry Real, who is from I don't know how old he is now, but he's clearly from an older
I
generation.
think he's 74. Yeah, I think he's
Right, he
74.
is a manifestation of a Hamiltonian rather than, to borrow the term from Dunkelman, more of a Hamiltonian than a Jeffersonian figure.
Yes, I think so. I haven't read the Dunkelman book, but I think that
But
it makes sense
I
to
mean,
me.
it gets
Yeah.
boring at times, but his big point is an interesting one.
Well, and I mean, yes, and he's a and Terry is an effective person. He's a forceful person in the world. I think one of the real difficulties that I didn't get into in the article, but I know Richard Reeves is very much has thought an enormous amount about this and is a very difficult problem is solving that is easier for people who are for men in particular who are higher up on the kind of socioeconomic ladder. So you and I have all sorts of ways to be effectual in the world, to be forceful, to exert power in the world. The people who've really been left behind are the sort of lower income men who, at least in the stereotype, but I think one that broadly had truth to it, back in the day, they had working class jobs. They were the breadwinner for the family. Even if they weren't immensely powerful in the broader political sphere, even if they weren't like you and me, where we get to have these platforms where we speak to, you know, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, or occasionally when we're really lucky, millions of people, right? They had power and standing in their community, in their family, in their home, with their children, and now they just don't. And it's become, as our society's become more unequal and more of a kind of winner takes all economy, and more economic and social rewards accrue to people who've gone to college and grad school and things like that. I mean, these guys are just fucked, right? How are they supposed to feel powerful? And I don't have a good answer to that question. Like, that is a really tough question to answer. What if you're not good at school? Um, what if you're nerdy and you're not good at sports and you're not good at school and you come from a kind of working class or poor background? Like, what are your avenues for exerting power in a healthy way in the world? So it's not surprising that some of these men are attracted to exerting power in pretty unhealthy ways, whether that's Andrew Tate style masculinity or criminality, or they just check out, right? Or they just get high and and watch video games and porn and so on and just do nothing, right?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of passive men not being attractive, it certainly explains, as you suggest, the Trump phenomenon. For whatever you say about him, he's certainly not passive.
Right. Well, and there's an identification with him, right? So I think if you're feeling some sort of powerlessness or something in your own life, not to get too psychological about it, but but I don't know how to think about the Trump phenomenon without mass psychologizing people, because he can, if there's an identification with him and his
And he's
exertion of
even got the
dominance.
therapist's niece who's written the books about him to add to
Oh,
the.
is that Mary or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, so you can kind of enact sort of fantasies of power in a sort of through the sort of political movement or the political figure that you're not enacting in your own life. I think there's something to that. I know people hate it when you kind of mass
Yeah, I don't know if you've
psychologize.
seen the movie The Apprentice, which is an excellent film about his early life. And I mean, it doesn't always come across as being that bad, but the worst thing he does in the film, which is pretty bad, is rape his first wife. So,
I mean,
uh,
I think he was horribly traumatized by his father. I mean,
yeah, I
it,
mean, the
it,
father element there. I mean, if you think you had bad parents, God knows what his father.
and Elon Musk too. I mean, this is all
Yeah,
public
Musk is
record.
another good example.
Like, these were people who were emotionally brutalized by their parents, but particularly by their father. Like, I just don't know how you look at that and don't see the way they behave as, like, just manifestations of their trauma. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, so it's deeply political. I mean, I think Terry has an answer. The only answer I can see is men do need to become more emotionally articulate. We do need to get more in touch with our feelings, and we do need to learn to be sort of feeling vulnerable people in ways that are powerful. It does
And
not
what do
mean
women need? Because one of the things that came out of the piece was that you had, I mean, you were writing it, of course, but it seemed like you had more to learn, or that Terry Real was going to teach you more than your wife, Jess. What do women need to learn? Because it's not a one-way thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, look, it was my story. I mean, as I said, I was negotiating with my wife. There are things, there's things that she brings to there's issues she brings to the marriage that I was not, that the article was not dedicated to characterizing. She can write her own thing and own her own shit, and she certainly has it. She comes from a pretty difficult background. Her father was an alcoholic, died pretty tragically. She was relatively young. She's whatever. She's got her whole bucket of thing. What do women have to learn? I mean, so Terry talks in his, and this is complicated, but I'll lay it out in the kind of simple version first. Terry talks, to me, but in his books and his seminars about kind of the blatant and the latent. And often the blatant is sort of identified with the male figure. And it's the person who's kind of expressing their distress in a more direct, overt way, yelling, nastiness, sarcasm, I guess at the worst forms, physical abuse and things like that. And then the latent is the person who's bringing their distress into the marriage in dysfunctional ways, but it's in more indirect ways. So passive aggression or sort of controlling behavior or little nagging comments or withdrawal. So it's there and it's dysfunctional, but it's not overt, it's latent. And a lot of the work, his particular system of therapy is, I think, he will say empower. So it just looks different. It's trying to empower the person in the latent position, who is often the woman and is kind of, you can think of it as a kind of feminized position. Empower her to be more articulate about her needs and wants. And be willing to risk not just more distress in the marriage, but maybe the end of the marriage. Like, this is what I want from you. I want you to take more responsibility for managing the household. I want you to whatever. I want you to stop yelling at me. I want you to stop cheating on me, whatever it is. I want you to be more, express your affection more directly. And the reason that's complicated is, and I've gotten this feedback from people when I've sort of talked about this or written about this in other spaces, is that it ends up constructing a narrative of the modern American woman as if she's like a version of the 1950s passive woman, which just doesn't feel accurate to most people, and certainly doesn't feel accurate to me in describing my wife, who is a very forceful person, and powerful person. I think it's just like it can be maybe the way to sort of characterize it, that sort of kind of nuances that sort of passive presentation of it, is like these things, like the criticism, the like passive aggression, these things can be pretty overt. I mean, they can be pretty blatant, even if we call them so. It's trying to take them out of the space of this kind of resentful passive expression of them, or indirect expression of them, and demanding of them that they express it. But again, they express it in a sort of in a constructive way. Not like, "Oh, you have a lot of time to, play around on social media, don't you, Dan?" Like, that's a kind of, but instead, like, "Hey, whatever." He's very demanding. It's like, "Hey," again, not, and first of all, not doing it in front of our friends, right? In a situation where I can't respond in a way, we can't have a constructive conversation. But if she's frustrated that I'm doing something on social media when she's carrying the domestic burden, then it's like, "Hey, Dan, I love you. I know you've been working really hard. I know you're really committed to this. Like, I'm a little frustrated that it sounds like, because I'm doing so much of the work around the house, like, I'm a little frustrated when it feels like you're off at work, but you're not really working. Could you," and then you offer, you know, "Could you reassure me that you're really committed to work, or could you reassure me that you're really committed to getting your work done so that you can reassume some of the, household burden," or so, but doing it in a really constructive,
I
loving.
mean, if you don't, I'm going to kill you.
Well, ultimately, sometimes what it can be is, "Hey, if you don't do this, like, I, we need to seek counseling, or I'm going to move out, or I'm not going to do this for you that you've come to expect. You can't expect me to." I mean, he's not recommending a sex strike, but it's like, there's a lot of things I think he would say, that Terry would say, that women do to manage their men, whether it's having sex with them regularly, whether it's, soothing them when they're feeling distressed, whether it's taking up more
Although
of
I
the
wonder
load.
with sex drugs, many years ago got into trouble for writing a satirical piece on an intended sex strike by students at UC Berkeley, where I was a graduate student in the 80s. Whether you're cutting off your nose to spite your face when it comes to that.
Well, sometimes I think, and
I
my
mean,
wife,
it's
my
we
wife is,
men, Dan. We're the ones who should be doing the sex strike, especially if the women's bringing in more money and working harder.
well, you're making the assumption that they want what we have, which, unfortunately, sometimes if we're not we're not
Yeah,
if
we're
we're
not
not
going to
being
go there. This is still a family show. Finally,
well, wait, I just wanted to say though, like, my wife has seen a lot of couples over the years where women are having sex with men and they just don't want to be, but it is a way of managing the men and managing their expectations. And so it's not a sex strike, and
wow.
it's
And
not a
it's not
sex
true with
strike.
men. I mean, it's not true with men doing the same thing, you think?
Look, I'm just, this is a, who knows, this is just anecdotes. Like, she has not had the same situation with men doing the same thing. And again, it is not, so it's not a sex strike in these cases. You could call it that, but really it is women saying, I don't want to have sex with you. Like, I'm not attracted to you right now, or I'm resentful about these things. Like, the forced thing is the having of the sex. It's not the not having of the sex, because that is where they would prefer to be when they're not feeling attracted to their partners.
And that's real power. That's where men have to be perhaps more powerful. Finally, Dan, in an America that's increasingly divided, I mean, Donald Trump claims it isn't, but it's just as divided in 2025 as it was in 2024 or 2020 or 2016 between two very different camps. An America which isn't getting along. One of my favorite guests on the show is Ali Hochschild,
Oh yeah.
who's written about bringing the worlds together. She brings a kind of therapeutic analysis, I think, as a sociologist and writer, to the divisions in America. Do you think that the story of you and Jess's therapy and coming back together, the story ends on a positive note? It suggests that your marriage now is stronger than it's ever been. Could it be a kind of maybe a model or a metaphor for America coming back together? Do we need Terry Real to be working rather on you and Jess on America itself, on blue and red America?
Uh, here's the complicated answer to that. If we could clone Terry about, I don't know how many clients each Terry clone could take. If we could clone Terry about, you know,
We
uh,
got AI now. We probably
yeah,
can.
if we could clone Terry about 8 million times and assign every, American couple to one of the Terry clones, like, I think he could bring us all back together. He's an extraordinarily gifted clinician. Part of the problem is these things are not replicable. Like, Terry can train people in his system, and that probably makes them better therapists, but it doesn't make them Terry. Like, he's the Michael Jordan or the LeBron James of therapy, or he's one of them. So at an individual level, and I've talked to Terry about this a lot, like, at an individual level, he can bring people together and he can bridge divides. I don't know how to scale that. Like, and I'm not even sure therapy as an industry is making things better. It might be making things worse, because in a lot of forms, and I worried about my article in the sense, in a lot of forms, it's encouraging a kind of reductionistic, kind of diagnostic frame on things that I'm not sure makes us better. There's a lot of, like, self-care and self-empowerment stuff that doesn't seem ultimately very constructive or collaborative. So Terry has theories about how to bring America together. I don't agree with a lot of them. Like, I think it has to be like, I we need some kind of revolution in consciousness or something. Like, I've gotten, it's very pessimistic and utopian at the same time. Like, we need people kind of uh spontaneously self-organizing into groups that connect with each other. I think we're polarized, we're atomized, we're terrible at figuring out how to relate to each other in a kind of deep, meaningful way. We're taking out a lot of our personal struggles and trauma, and pouring them into politics in this really destructive way. Like, I don't know what's your answer? I don't know the answer. Like,
Yeah, that's well, maybe
therapy's
that's
not
a
therapy's
well,
not the answer because it doesn't scale. There's a lot of
what does but what does
shitty
Terry
therapists
Real
out.
say? You said that Terry has an idea too. I have to get him on the show.
Well, yeah, you should have Terry on. I mean, what would Terry say? I mean, Terry would talk about it in kind of a global sense. Like he would talk about the ideas that we need to sort of adopt an ecological consciousness and a relational consciousness, and we need to talk about patriarchy and the damage that patriarchy does to boys and all of it. And it's not that I disagree with those ideas, but I think that they're not like he's not the Michael Jordan of like articulating new political syntheses that will help us talk past each other. Like they too easily fall into these sort of progressive frames that I think often exacerbate things and have the effect of making people feel stigmatized or men feel stigmatized or something like that. Like I don't think that's if there's some great political discourse or ideology that will help us transcend our current sort of gridlock, like it's going to have to come from somebody who's like the Michael Jordan of writing or philosophy or political theory or political rhetoric. And Terry's fine, but he's just not that. Like he's the Michael Jordan of doing therapy. He's not the Michael Jordan of like of a political rhetoric that can help us transcend our divisions. But he would talk about those ideas, I think. But I just don't think they're going to solve it. I don't know. I don't know what will. Like what? I mean, do you see any green shoots? Like
Mm.
I don't know. The most optimistic I get is just like, hey, we had these huge revolutions in the 60s and 70s around gender and sexuality and race in the like 50s through 70s. And we're still just all that stuff still shaking out. Like we're still just
Right. Well, I mean, maybe it goes to you, or it comes back to the point I made earlier, is that for all the arguments and unpleasantness you and Jess had, you still wanted to stay together, and that may be still true of America.
Hey, look, I'm not hopeless. Like, Terry will say, therapy is 30 years behind on helping men. Like, it's made a lot of progress in helping women. I think if you look at how, how good a job we've done of empowering women and helping women kind of step out of that passive role, it seems possible that we can do this kind of cultural work. We just haven't done it very well with men yet. Maybe we just need another, if we survive this long, we just need another 20, 30 years to and I mean, maybe we'll look back. I mean, the work that Richard is doing is really remarkable. And like, he deserves an immense amount of credit for it. And I think he's like a deeply humane figure and has figured out how to kind of negotiate these very complicated political lines to get people thinking about boys and men in ways that don't easily just kind of fall apart around these political divisions. So
no, we'll have to get Richard Reeves and maybe Terry Real, Daniel Oppenheimer. We need a woman as well to talk these things through. But excellent conversation. You didn't storm out once, Daniel. How I learned that the problem in my marriage was me. A really deep, if that's the right word, essay about his own marriage and how he has got closer, improved the marriage through Terry Real and through his own responsible behavior. Congratulations. Congratulations, Daniel, both on the piece and on your now strong marriage. Send my best to
well,
Jess.
it's getting there. I will. And thanks, Andrew. This was